Hi.
Hello. In chapter 17 of Genesis, in the last segment, we noted progress in the expansion of the promises of the Abrahamic covenant to Abraham now. His name has been changed in 17, and also the sign of the covenant, circumcision. And Abraham has circumcised all the male members of his household. Now you get to chapter 18, which apparently happens shortly after. So let's read through the relevant passages down to verse 15 to see what develops from the specific promises of 17 that, no, your seed will be through Sarah.
Okay. Afterward, Jehovah appeared to him among the big trees of Mamre, while he was sitting at the entrance of the tent about the heat of the day. When he raised his eyes, then he looked, and there 3 men were standing some distance from him. When he caught sight of them, he began running to meet them from the entrance of the tent, and proceeded to bow down to the earth. Then he said, Jehovah, if now I have found favor in your eyes, please do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be taken, please, and you must have your feet washed. Then recline under the tree, and let me get a piece of bread and refresh your hearts. Following that, you can pass on, because that is why you have passed this way to your servant. At this they said, All right, you may do just as you have spoken. So Abraham went hurrying to the tent to Sarah and said, Hurry, get 3 seah measures of fine flour. Knead the dough and make round cakes. Next Abraham ran to the herd and proceeded to get a tender and good young bull and to give it to the attendant, and he went hurrying to get it ready. Then he took butter and milk and the young bull that he had got ready and set it before them. Then he himself kept standing by them under the tree as they were eating. They now said to him, Where is Sarah, your wife? To this he said, Here in the tent. So he continued, I am surely going to return to you next year at this time. And look, Sarah your wife will have a son. Now Sarah was listening at the tent entrance, and it was behind the man. And Abraham and Sarah were old, being advanced in years. Sarah had stopped having menstruation. Hence Sarah began to laugh inside herself, saying, After I am worn out, shall I really have pleasure, my Lord, being old besides? Then Jehovah said to Abraham, Why was it that Sarah laughed, saying, Shall I really and truly give birth, although I have become old? Is anything too extraordinary for Jehovah? At the appointed time I shall return to you next year at this time, and Sarah will have a son. But Sarah began to deny it, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. At this he said, No, but you did laugh.
Needless to say, this is not a chapter in which Jehovah's Witnesses are encouraged to spend much time. The difficulties, the wonders really, when you think of it from a non-Jehovah's Witness point of view, pile up here.
Yeah, a lot of difficulties.
First, again, Jehovah appears. But when Abraham looks up, what does he see? This is something different than the other appearances.
He sees 3 men at a distance from him and runs to meet them. And then he addresses one of them as Jehovah.
Now that's very interesting, because the New World Translation has him addressing Jehovah in verse 3, whereas most modern translations don't. Now how does the Watchtower justify that in its footnote?
A footnote for that verse. It reads, so verse 3 we're talking about. This is the first of 134 places where the Jewish Sopharim changed YHWH to Adonai. This substitution was made out of misapplied reverence for God's name.
So the Watchtower feels justified in reinserting the name, the sacred name, the tetragram, in the text even though the Masoretic text, which they normally use, and which, by the way, is the chief source of the Hebrew text of the Old Testament for most modern Bibles, such as in this Kohlenberger interlinear Hebrew English Old Testament, there's not even a footnote here. Because the Masoretic text, the one we generally use, that is used in this massive interlinear,
just uses Lord.
Uses Lord. But the Watchtower has made a strange choice here, because in their zeal to get the name of Jehovah into the text as often as they can, they've multiplied problems for their theology.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't know, I'll ask you, how often did you read Genesis chapter 18? I didn't read it often, and if I did, I probably would have been reading just little bits and pieces, as that's the way they usually present passages. So you wouldn't have read it in context and seen the difficulty of these three men, and one of them being addressed as Jehovah. This was kind of new to me, and I don't know if I should tell them the story. That
maybe a little later.
Oh, okay.
But here maybe they thought it was worth the risk, because so few witnesses spend any time thinking about this chapter.
Right.
And perhaps it's because the rest of the story, that is the other verses we read down to verse 15, won't allow any other interpretation but the obvious one, namely that Abraham's looking at the three men and identifies at least one of them as Jehovah. Why would he be able to do that? Well, he's seen Jehovah several times already, apparently by himself.
That's right. It's not the first time that Jehovah has appeared to him.
So he treats him like a guest. He wants to wash his feet, to feed him, sit, enjoy my hospitality.
And he does.
And he does.
Yeah. So you've got Jehovah appearing, talking to him, eating, and
having his feet washed.
Yeah.
These are typical signs of Hebrew hospitality 4,000 years ago and beyond. And apparently there's no problem for the Jewish mind of the days of the patriarchs, at least. Of course, we say Jewish, and we're retrojecting a term that really wasn't in use back then.
Right.
The Hebrew mind of 2000 BC, we might want to say safely, has no problem with God appearing on earth.
Yeah.
Well, but as a Jehovah's Witness, you just can't deal with that.
Yeah.
But
actually, the Jewish people also now would have the same kind of opposition to it as Jehovah's Witnesses would.
Which is why the footnote is revealing, because yes, you're saying that in effect you, Jehovah's Witnesses, have the same problem that the Hebrew rabbis would have with this text. Jehovah is getting too close.
Yeah.
And in the Septuagint, oftentimes the Greek rendering of many of these texts, the Hebrew is somehow skirted around so that you don't have the discomfort of thinking. It's too much, giving too much space to the thought that God is like us for the Hebrew mind of the intertestamental period.
So they would be doing it out of a motive of wanting God to be reverential and distant.
Well, wanting us to be reverential towards him, which amounts to distancing him from us.
Yeah.
Yeah, as the Septuagint habitually does. But the text goes on, it's very plain that Jehovah is talking to man, and man is talking to Jehovah as a man.
Right.
So verse 9 says, they said to him, where's Sarah?
Yeah.
She's in the tent. But then Jehovah said, I will surely return to you about this time next year. And the next little passage about Sarah laughing is really interesting, because where is Sarah, and is she talking out loud?
Yeah, well, no, she's in the tent still.
At the door of the tent, it says.
Listening, like women will do.
Hey.
Listening to what's going on and overhearing this, and then chuckling to herself, thinking, oh, is this possible? I'm 90 years old. I'm going to have a baby?
Apparently doubting.
Yes.
Not joy, but cynicism, we might say.
Yeah.
And their response to it, though, is a gentle gesture in the direction of saying, no, this really is Jehovah, because Jehovah knows what she's thinking.
Yeah. Without her even being there, he can call her out on it.
So it's very clear that this text will provide several difficulties for any Jehovah's Witnesses. That's why we encourage everybody to use it frequently when you're in dialogue with the witnesses, because even if they won't give any ground at the time, they'll remember it. I think it had some impact upon you.
It will disturb them enough that it can be, you know, a gate crasher, if you like. For me it was, because I remember when David was, I don't even know if he was going to meetings anymore, but I remember a long trip back from his parents' place. We were on a bus ride and we were talking about this chapter, and David was reading it to me, and it was new to me, kind of. It was like I knew some of it, but I certainly didn't know the stuff about three men. And
you didn't notice the details?
Yeah, I didn't notice the details. So that was already a shake, you know, it had shaken me. I didn't know how to respond to it. And I kept saying, no, it's not possible. God can't be physically present in front of people. And I was very insistent, and, you know, my Watchtower training was in full vigor there. And then David read verse 14. Is anything too extraordinary for Jehovah? And I think it was a light bulb moment for me. It was like, okay, I'm like Sarah. Sarah can't believe something that's going to happen, which seems more unbelievable in some ways. She can't believe that, and she's putting limits on God.
So as a witness...
And then I was thinking, well, that's what I'm doing. I'm putting limits on God. How do you put limits on God? If you can put limits on God, He's not God.
So you would have allowed an angel to appear in flesh and eat and have his feet washed. And you would allow Jehovah to know, assuming that this is an angel and Jehovah's just speaking through him, you would allow the angel to speak in the name of Jehovah. Some miracle's going to happen next year that's inconceivable, literally inconceivable to you as Sarah. And you will allow God, Jehovah, if you're a Jehovah's Witness, to know the future hundreds, even thousands of years in advance.
All those things seemed okay. But it's just your training. It's what you've been told all your life is okay for God. This is what God can do. And you don't think about the fact that you're putting some limits to God. You're saying, yes, He can do that, but He can't do whatever you want to put in there.
And to be fair, it's usually because you have some proof text from somewhere in the Bible that says, no, that's out. But of course this is first. This is primary, because we are told in the book of Genesis, which came long before John 1:18, by the way, the text we usually go to. No one can see God. God has never been seen at any time. Yet this text is here. And the paradox is something we have to deal with. But for me, the control is verse 14. As it says in there, is anything too extraordinary for Jehovah? In other Bibles, is anything impossible for Jehovah? Is anything too wonderful for Jehovah? And that should hang us all when it comes to putting boundaries around what God can and cannot do.
And even
paradox.
And I think on defining God, and we try and wrap them all up in a nice package and say, this is what God is, what He's like. Well, that's pretty arrogant to think that you can explain God. That's
the sin of the second commandment that is identified by the first two commandments of the 10. Putting God in a box, making some kind of image of God that allows you to control what He can and cannot do. In the next segment, the wonders multiply. We have Jehovah walking with Abraham now, towards Sodom, and even negotiating with Abraham.